The language of children is behavior. Feelings such as loss, grief, and sadness may be expressed in angry, alienating behaviors. Children with attachment problems often try to protect themselves against further hurt, shame, and anxiety by using behavior to push away those closest to them. Fortunately, children with attachment disorders can be treated successfully. With the support of their families and help from trained professionals, these children can learn to have healthy, loving, and trusting relationships.
Attachment disorder has a number of definitions. The most official one is really quite inadequate, because it really says the child is behaving inappropriately in most of their social situations. This doesn't really let us know what's going on with the child or what to look for. What we've seen is that many children who have attachment disorder have difficulty trusting, may have difficulty in their relationships with peers. They sometimes have difficulty with their attention or their ability to manage their behavior. There's so many different ways that early attachment disruption can disrupt development that really the diagnosis we've been using is not very useful. Attachment disorder can manifest in a number of ways, but the underlying feature of them all is that the baby or the child doesn't trust the caregiving environment to be there for him for whatever he needs. Healthy attachment can be interrupted by a number of different factors. Probably the most obvious one is that a child can lose a caregiver. For a baby especially, a caregiver is their whole world, and losing a caregiver means losing everything. The other things that can interrupt a healthy attachment are illness of the mother when she's not available emotionally, unpredictable caregiving, and of course, abuse and serious neglect.
I think one of the great breakthroughs in the last decade is the neuroscientists have been able to show the impact of abuse, neglect, and family violence, and especially chronic experiences of traumatic stress on the development of children. The parents have known for ages, and neuroscientists have been able to show in the last decade, is how experiences like that of your child impact the brain and impact specific structures in the brain. So they've been able to show that children have experienced chronic neglect in particular, and also chronic experiences of abuse, violence, but most particularly neglect, lead to such things like shrunken or less development of key structures in the brain, like the anterior cingulate, like the hippocampus, the corpus callosum, and other structures that help a child to be able to succeed and function. And that includes to be able to regulate feelings and emotions. And of course, that's a key capacity to succeed in preschool, a key capacity to succeed in kindergarten, at first and second grade. So we often see with children who have had chronic experiences of neglect and abuse that they have trouble regulating their emotions. And that can be really traced to the impact of the abuse and neglect, to frankly often a decreased size of parts of their brain, and to a differential response compared to children who've received love and care and a secure attachment, which conversely helps to grow the brain and grow the ability to regulate. So often we see with children that have had chronic experiences of traumatic stress, the great difficulty managing feelings. They're easily set off, they may explode. The adults around them may not see what sets them off, but they do see the reaction. and at times it could be frightening, and often that reflects what the child learned they needed to do to survive. They may have needed to scream, to wail, or they wouldn't have gotten fed in the orphanage. They may have been desperate for basic nurturance. They may have felt abandoned and feeling that any time a key adult leaves the room, that once again they could literally be starving or starving for attention, which we know again ties into what children need to develop.
The developmental trauma disorder is a new disorder, a diagnosis proposed by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, and it is a diagnosis that seeks to capture the range of impact that we see with children that have had complex trauma in their lives. And so it focuses not just on the behavior of children, but looks at things like affect regulation, the way that children think in a distorted way, how their sense of self is damaged, how they can be dissociative, and how they can have really severe problems with attachment. Well, as you see, the breadth of these problems overlap with a lot of different possible diagnoses. And so what's happened is children with attachment-related difficulties and trauma have tended to collect a range of diagnoses like attention deficit disorder, bipolar disorder, other disruptive behavior disorders. And the problem is that those disorders never capture the underlying problem, that they are simply behavioral. And so when children collect that list of diagnoses, the real problem is never addressed and therefore never solved.
It seems to me that about 30-some years ago, Foster Cline is the person who really brought attachment disorder into the awareness of therapists and parents. At that point in time, I think it's pretty safe to say that it was almost a completely psychosocial model and a psychosocial disorder. As neuroscience knowledge has exploded in the past 10 years, maybe even 5 years, certainly the entire attachment field has embraced that knowledge and used it to have even a broader understanding and maybe a more specific understanding of what was thought to be primarily a psychosocial problem. I think that people knew that trauma, and the early people talking about attachment disorder certainly explained and discussed trauma and the impact that it had on attachment disorder. But I think they guessed that there was some actual physiological involvement, but there wasn't enough research to lead us to that conclusion. And now that's pretty much where the field is in terms of being related very specifically to trauma and how trauma has impacted brain development and has impacted the psychosocial aspect of what was initially looked at.
Adults with attachment disorder as children will grow a personality disorder among other mental illnesses. So we'll see an antisocial personality disorder. It's prone to develop into a borderline personality disorder. On the mental health side, apart from personal functioning, we'll end up with kids that grow into very depressed, even suicidal adults, have debilitating anxieties, and even psychotic levels of mental illness. They'll end up with two different kinds of difficulties. One will be in their personality functioning, which we refer to as personality disorders. Typically, an adult who had a childhood history of reactive attachment disorder is going to either have an antisocial personality disorder, or they're going to have a borderline personality disorder. On the other side, we have the potential for them to develop depression and anxiety, even to the extent of being suicidal or unable to function in a daily living situation. So both can be very debilitating and devastating in their personal functioning. With proper treatment, we're definitely going to improve the odds that they'll function better. So we'll have fewer characteristics of the personality disorder. Hopefully, if there's a mental illness with a tendency to depression or anxiety, we're going to find that the young adult will be able to self-regulate and monitor their own emotional conditions, seeking help and intervention when it's warranted. So that will definitely upgrade their opportunity for personal adjustment and growth.
There's so many variabilities in whether or not children heal, but I think we are fast approaching a time when we have at our disposal most of the tools we need to help children and families heal. We know what to look for. We know how to observe once we didn't. We know that since behavior is always meaningful, always stands for something, we know how to look for that. We know how to follow it up with questions, and we know how to support families. We don't always do that, but we certainly have the tools, and therefore I would say all children soon will have the potential to heal. I think unquestionably there is. From my perspective as a clinician, the hope lies particularly in 2 or 3 discoveries of the last few years. One of them is our finally coming to grips with the fact that babies remember, that young children know about their experiences and can and do tell us about them and their behavior. And what that makes possible is more knowledge about the child's early experience, but it also means that we're not just stuck with fretting about the behavior itself. We decide that the behavior of a young child is always meaningful, and hope lies in paying attention to that behavior as if it's meaningful and following it to its original source. Huge hope for clinicians and parents in that.